The red alarm lights flashed across the metal corridors of Starbase Vega, and the air filled with shouts and confusion as soldiers ran through the narrow halls holding their plasma rifles ready to fire. And at the center of it all stood a young woman with glowing blue tattoos running down her arm. Her name was Mira Hale, and every eye around her was filled with fear and anger. They called her a traitor, a criminal, someone who had betrayed the fleet. But she only stood still, her hands raised, her eyes calm as if she already knew this moment would come, and when the officer shouted, "Take her away," she did not fight. She only whispered under her breath that she had done nothing wrong, that the ink on her arm was not what they thought it was. The guards dragged her through the crowd, and whispers followed her wherever she went. People saying that she was one of the rebels, that her mark was the sign of the ones who once tried to destroy the fleet, and that anyone with that blue light on their skin deserved to be locked away forever. But deep inside, Mira knew the truth. She had earned that mark through loyalty, not betrayal. She had saved lives during the Great War, and that symbol was meant to honor those who stood for the innocent, not the corrupt. But no one wanted to listen. No one cared about her story. They only saw the glowing mark and the fear that came with it. In the control room, Commander Voss watched the screen showing Mira being taken into the holding area, his cold eyes narrowing as he said that criminals like her had no place in the fleet, and that her execution should be swift. The younger officers looked uneasy. Some whispered that maybe the charges were too harsh, but Voss silenced them with a glare, saying that loyalty was obedience and disobedience was treason. And in that moment the words echoed through the base like an iron rule. Mira sat alone in the dim cell, the lights flickering around her as the station's engines hummed in the distance. She traced the tattoo with her finger, watching it faintly pulse in the dark. It was made of nanolight ink, something that responded to emotion, and even now it glowed softly as if alive. She remembered the day she received it years ago under the supervision of Admiral Corrin, the same man who had trained her, taught her that loyalty meant protecting people even when it defied orders. He had placed that ink on her arm himself, and told her it would always guide her when the world turned blind. She closed her eyes and whispered his name, wondering where he was now. Rumors said he had died during the last battle, but Mira never believed it. She felt that he was still alive somewhere beyond the stars, maybe still fighting the same fight she had taken. She hoped that one day the truth would come to light. Outside the cell, a young soldier named Aaron stood guard. He watched her quietly, feeling a strange sense of doubt. He had seen many prisoners before, but none looked like her. She didn't seem dangerous. She seemed tired, like someone who had carried too much for too long. When she looked up, their eyes met, and for a moment he felt something shift inside him, as if the story he had been told didn't fit what he was seeing before him. Mira spoke softly, asking him why they called her a traitor. He said it was because she worked with the rebels years ago. She smiled faintly and said she never did that. Everything she ever did was for the fleet, not against it. He didn't know what to say, and before he could answer, Commander Voss entered the corridor. His voice sharp as a blade, he ordered Aaron to leave the post and not to talk to the prisoner again. As the heavy doors closed behind Voss, Mira looked at the wall where the shadows danced. She could feel that something was wrong, that the fleet she once served had changed, that the loyalty she believed in had been twisted into fear and control. She pressed her hand to the cold metal and made herself a promise. She would not die as a criminal. She would live to prove what that ink really meant. Hours passed. The base grew quiet. Only the hum of the engines filled the air. Mira sat still, listening to her own heartbeat, when suddenly a soft sound came from the corner of the cell. It was her old communicator hidden in her boot. She pulled it out, trembling, and saw a blinking message waiting. She hesitated, then pressed it open. The screen flickered, showing words she did not expect. They said, "They're coming for you. Do not trust anyone." The message vanished a second later, leaving only static. Her breath quickened. She looked toward the locked door, wondering who had sent it. Was it a warning or a trap? She didn't know, but she knew one thing. Someone out there still remembered her, still knew the truth, and that meant hope. Even if it was small. She leaned back against the wall, the blue light of her tattoo reflecting off the steel. Her mind filled with the voice of Admiral Corrin as she remembered the moment he gave her the mark. He had said, "This ink is not for rebels, it is for the loyal ones who protect the innocent no matter what." And as she whispered those words again, she felt strength returning. The world could call her a criminal, but one day they would understand that the ink on her arm was not a mark of shame. It was a symbol of loyalty, waiting to be seen for what it truly was. The storm outside Starbase Vega was unlike anything the crew had ever seen. Lightning cracked across the distant planets as if the heavens themselves were at war, and inside her cell, Mira Hale sat wide awake, the blue light from her tattoo glowing brighter than ever. The words from the mysterious message echoed in her head. "They're coming for you. Do not trust anyone." She had read those words over and over until they were burned into her mind. And now every sound in the corridor, every echo of boots made her heart race faster. She knew something was coming. She just did not know if it was rescue or doom. Metal door hissed open, and Lieutenant Aaron stepped inside, his face pale. His hands shaking as he held a small data chip. He whispered quickly, saying she had to listen and not speak loud because the cameras were watching. He slid the chip across the table and said he found it hidden in the command logs marked with her name. Mira looked at it suspiciously, asking what it was. Aaron said it was an old mission record from years ago. The title read, Operation Haven. Mira froze when she heard that name because only one person had ever spoken those words to her. Admiral Aaron said he didn't understand any of it, but the file was locked under the Admiral's code. When he tried to open it, the system warned him that access was restricted. To Loyal Division members, Mira felt tears form in her eyes because that name, Loyal Division, was what the tattoo truly meant. It was not rebellion. It was protection. She realized whoever sent the message wanted her to remember who she was before she could explain. Alarms began to blare across the station. The voice of Commander Voss came through the speakers announcing that the prisoner would be transferred immediately to the high-security prison on Titan Gate. The guards surrounded Mira's cell, preparing for departure. Aaron was assigned to escort her to the transport ship, and when he looked at her, he felt the weight of something he couldn't name, like he was about to take an innocent soul into darkness. The shuttle lifted off under the red sky, and the rain hit the hull like angry drums. Mira sat with her hands bound but her eyes sharp. She looked at Aaron and asked quietly if he believed she was guilty. He didn't answer. Instead, he stared out the window, pretending not to hear, but deep down, the doubt inside him was growing louder each minute. She told him she knew the fleet's secret, that Commander Voss was hiding something, and that her arrest was only the beginning of something much bigger. He warned her to stop talking, but when she said the name Corin, he turned to her sharply and asked how she knew that name. She said because he was her commander and her teacher, and that he gave her the mark that now made her a criminal. Before Aaron could reply, the shuttle jolted. Violently, a blinding light flashed outside the window. The pilot shouted that they were under attack. Unknown ships were approaching from the nebula ahead. Mira felt the hair on her arms rise because she had seen that kind of movement before. Those were not pirates, those were shadow units, old fleet models long erased from the system. The same kind used by the Loyal Division during the war. Explosions rocked the cabin. The lights flickered. Aaron grabbed a blaster and shouted for the pilot to send a distress call, but the signal was jammed. Mira broke free from her restraints using a hidden blade she had kept inside her boot. Aaron pointed the weapon at her, but she shouted that she could save them if he trusted her. He hesitated. But another blast shook the shuttle, tearing part of the hull. Mira rushed to the control panel, her tattoo glowing like a beacon. She touched the console and the systems reacted instantly. Rerouting power shields rose just in time to block another attack. Aaron watched in shock as she worked the codes, her fingers moving like she had done this 100 times. The pilot screamed that a missile was locked onto them. Mira closed her eyes and spoke a command phrase that no current fleet member should even know. The ship's old defense grid activated, firing a counterbeam that destroyed the missile before impact. Aaron stared at her, speechless, asking how she knew those codes. Mira only said that the Admiral taught her, and that if they wanted to live, he had to trust her completely. The shuttle drifted into the dark nebula, smoke and debris floating all around them. Aaron finally lowered his weapon, realizing she had saved them. They were alive because of her, not in spite of her. The pilot was unconscious, From the blast, so Mira and Aaron worked together to stabilize the engines. She explained that the Loyal Division was created to protect civilians when the fleet began attacking colonies that refused to.
Surrender, the fleet called them rebels, but they were actually heroes who defied corrupt orders. Orin listened in silence, his mind spinning. He realized that everything he had been told about her might have been a lie. They finally managed to power the backup thrusters, and Myra set the course toward the nearest beacon, but the signal that appeared on their radar was faint and strange. It came from an unregistered region of space, a sector long abandoned after the war. Orin warned that it might be dangerous, but Myra smiled faintly and said that sometimes danger was where the truth waited. He couldn't argue. He had already seen her defy death once. As the shuttle glided deeper into the nebula, they saw shapes moving in the mist, huge metallic shadows that looked like ships, but with no fleet markings, no lights, no life. Orin whispered that they were ghost ships. Myra's voice was calm when she said maybe not ghosts, maybe forgotten soldiers. And as the radar filled with signals, she felt a tattoo glow brighter than ever. It pulsed in rhythm with the ghost ships, as if calling to them. The comms crackled with static, and then a voice, faint but powerful, came through the noise. It said, "Myra, hail. You were never meant to be a prisoner. Follow the light, and remember who you are." Orin turned toward her, his eyes wide, asking who that was, but Myra already knew the voice. Even after all these years, she knew it. It was Admiral Corin. And in that moment, she realized the fight was far from over. It was only beginning. The dark nebula stretched around them like an endless ocean of smoke and lightning. The shuttle floated slowly through it, half broken, half alive. Myra sat near the cracked window, watching blue sparks ripple across the void. Her tattoo glowed brighter than before, each pulse matching the silent rhythm outside. And in that eerie glow, Orin kept glancing at her, wondering what kind of person could face death with such calm. She looked fragile, but something about her eyes told him she had seen worse things than storms. The radar beeped again, showing hundreds of faint signals surrounding them. The shapes moved like ghosts, drifting in silence through the mist. Orin whispered that they should turn back, that this was not fleet territory. But Myra shook her head, her voice soft yet firm, saying that this was the only place they could go because this was where Project Haven was born. He frowned, saying that the name was classified, erased from every record, but she told him that erasing something didn't mean it stopped existing. It just meant someone was scared of what it could reveal. Suddenly, the shuttle jolted as a tractor beam caught it, pulling them toward one of the massive ghost ships, its hull covered in dust and scars from ancient battles. The lights of the ship flickered as if waking from a long sleep. Orin tried to override the beam, but the controls were locked. Myra placed a glowing hand on the console, and the system obeyed her instantly. The tractor beam slowed, then released, as if recognizing her touch. Orin stared in disbelief, asking how that was possible. She said quietly, "Because this ship remembers its own." The shuttle landed with a metallic thud inside a vast hangar where the air was still and cold. Everything was covered in frost, and silence echoed off the walls as they stepped out. Myra's tattoo light reflected off broken panels, and shattered helmets scattered across the floor. She whispered that this was one of the Loyal Division's hidden carriers lost after the war. Its name was Serenity, and it once carried hundreds of soldiers who swore to protect the innocent. Orin asked, "What happened to them?" Myra said the fleet buried them all, not with weapons, but with lies. They moved through the corridor, lights flickering on one by one as if guiding them. The ship's core hummed faintly like a sleeping heart. Suddenly, a holographic projector came alive, showing the face of an older man with sharp eyes and a calm voice. Admiral Corin. His image flickered, but the tone carried strength. He spoke, saying that if anyone was seeing this, it meant the Loyal Division had fallen, and the truth had been silenced too long. He said the ink mark was more than just a symbol. It was a key to the truth, a code that could unlock the hidden archives of Project Haven. Myra stepped closer, her eyes wet as she whispered his name. Orin looked at her, realizing that this was not just loyalty, this was personal. She had believed he was dead, and now his memory spoke right before her. The hologram continued, explaining that Project Haven was designed to create safe worlds for refugees during the war, but the High Command had seen it as betrayal because it defied orders to destroy resistance colonies, so they erased it from history, branding every member a criminal. The hologram ended, leaving only silence. Myra stood frozen, her mind spinning with old memories. She remembered the screams of fire, the order to retreat, and how she stayed behind to save the civilians. Corin had covered her escape, and that was the last time she saw him. Orin finally broke the silence, asking what she planned to do with this truth. She turned toward him, her eyes burning with determination, saying that she would finish what the Admiral started. Before he could respond, alarms began to ring through the ship. Red lights flashed across the corridor. Orin checked the scanner, and his heart stopped. Fleet ships were approaching, dozens of them. Commander Voss had tracked their signal. Myra cursed under her breath. They had no weapons, no crew, no time. She ran toward the command bridge. Orin, following close behind. The control panels were dead, so she placed her hand on the console, her tattoo glowing brighter and brighter as she whispered the code the Admiral had taught her long ago, and suddenly the entire ship came to life, engines roaring, shields rising, lights blazing across the hull. Outside, the Ghost Fleet stirred other derelict ships, awakening one by one as if answering a forgotten call. Orin watched in, or as hundreds of lights appeared in the darkness, forming a silent armada. He said it was impossible. Myra smiled faintly, saying that loyalty never dies, it only sleeps, waiting for the right moment to wake again. The old systems began linking together, transmitting ancient battle frequencies long forgotten by the fleet. The ships aligned behind Serenity, forming defensive positions as if they still remembered their old commands. Commander Voss's voice came through the comms, sharp and cold, demanding Myra's surrender. He said she was a traitor, and that harboring her meant death for everyone aboard. Myra stood tall in front of the console, her voice calm, but filled with fire. She said that the fleet could destroy her, but not the truth, because the truth had already awakened, and the Admiral's mark would never fade. Voss shouted that she would finish, but his word would drown by the thunder of energy surging through the ship. Orin gripped the railing as the Ghost Fleet powered up their cannons, their lights cutting through the storm like blue fire. The fleet ships hesitated, facing an enemy they thought long gone. Myra gave the command to stand down unless attacked. She said they were not here for war, but for proof. The transmission from Serenity began to broadcast across the system, showing Corrin's message to every fleet frequency, the truth of Project Haven, spreading faster than Voss could stop it. The Admiral's hologram filled the stars, his voice echoing across space, saying that loyalty was not blind obedience, but courage to stand for what was right. Voss shouted orders to jam the signal, but one by one his ships began to fall silent, their crews refusing to fire. The truth had reached them. Myra watched, tears in her eyes, as the Ghost Fleet surrounded them, not as weapons of war, but as shield of honor. She whispered that the ink had spoken and that loyalty, once lost, had finally returned to the light. The storm outside the nebula glowed with blue fire as the Ghost Fleet surrounded Serenity, their lights flickering like ancient stars awakening after a long sleep. Myra stood on the bridge, her hand still resting on the console. As the voice of Admiral Corrin faded from the transmission, her heart pounded in her chest. She had done it. The truth was out across the system. Every fleet officer now knew about Project Haven and the lies that buried it, yet there was no peace. Only silence and the uneasy tension of what would happen next. Orin watched the radar, his voice trembling as he said that Commander Voss's flagship was moving closer, its weapons armed. Myra knew he would not stop now. He had come to erase her once and for all. The comms crackled with static, then Voss's face appeared on the main screen, his expression dark and full of pride. He called Myra a symbol of chaos, saying that she had infected the fleet with doubt and that loyalty to order must be restored. Myra looked back at him, her eyes calm, as she said that loyalty without truth was just slavery. Voss sneered, calling her words treason. He ordered her to surrender the ship or be destroyed, but before she could answer, another signal cut through the channel. A voice strong and deep said, "Stand down, Commander," and every soldier in the control room froze, because that voice belonged to Admiral Corrin, alive and commanding once more. Myra gasped as his image appeared on a secondary screen. He was older, his hair gray, his face lined with years of exile, but his eyes burned with the same fire. She remembered he told Voss that the war had changed nothing, that honor was still the heart of the fleet, and that Myra Hale bore the mark of the true loyal division, the same mark he had once worn himself. The room went silent as the soldiers listened in shock. Corrin raised his arm, showing the same glowing tattoo that Myra carried. The ink shimmered under the ship lights, and his words echoed across the fleet, saying, "This ink means loyalty, it means courage, it means those who protect others even when command forgets what protection means." Voss shouted that it was a trick, that Corrin had died long ago, and that anyone believing him were betraying the fleet, but his voice cracked with fear because deep down he knew Corrin was telling the truth. The Ghost Fleet signal amplified Corrin's transmission, and soon hundreds of ships began receiving it across nearby sectors, their captains hearing the Admiral's words and hesitating to obey Voss's orders. Orin watched the readings and said that more ships were standing down by the second. Myra turned toward him and whispered that the truth was stronger than any weapon. But Voss was not ready to surrender. His ship moved into attack position, weapons glowing red, ready to fire. Corrin's fleet, though small, positioned themselves between Voss and Serenity. Myra asked Corrin if they could win. He smiled faintly and said wars were not won by firing first, but by standing for what was right. Still, the danger was real. Voss ordered his ships to open fire. The first blast shook the nebula, energy waves bursting through space. Serenity trembled under impact. Alarms screamed across the bridge. Myra held onto the console, shouting for shields to maximum power. The ghost ships returned fire, but not to kill, only to block the attacks, forming a barrier of light between the fleets. The storm outside turned violent, lightning ripping through the mist, each flash lighting up the battlefield like day. Orin shouted that their shields were failing. Myra refused to back down. She opened an old command code deep in the system, the same one hidden in her tattoo. The code sent a signal to all loyal division vessels still buried in deep storage across the galaxy. The call of Haven. She called it the beacon of loyalty, and as she spoke the words, her tattoo glowed so bright it filled the bridge with blue light. Moments later, new signals appeared on the radar. Hundreds, maybe thousands, ships thought lost decades ago answering the call. They burst out of warp surrounding the battle from all sides. Voss's voice broke with panic, demanding to know what was happening. Myra said quietly, "The loyal have returned. And this time they remember who they are." The new fleet broadcasted Corrin's mark across every channel, the symbol of the ink shining across the stars for all to see. Voss's officers hesitated, refusing to follow his commands. He screamed at them, calling them cowards, but his own crew began lowering weapons. Orin turned to Myra, saying it was over, but she shook her head, saying not yet, because truth never ends with silence. Corrin stepped forward on the screen, his voice echoing through every ship, telling Voss that he could still choose honor by standing down and surrendering to justice. But Voss refused. Instead, he activated a final sequence of self-destruct command. Aimed at both fleets, Myra realized what he was doing and shouted for override, but it was too late. The countdown had begun. Orin rushed to the controls, trying to block the signal. Myra joined him, her fingers flying over the keys, her tattoo pulsing faster. As if alive, Corrin shouted commands to his crew, trying to disable the code across the network. The Ghost Fleet redirected power, their engines burning bright. As they absorbed the overload, Myra closed her eyes, whispering the loyalty phrase the Admiral had once taught her, and her tattoo released a wave of light spreading through the systems like water through fire. The explosion stopped the countdown, frozen. In mid-process, the lights dimmed and steadied across the ships. The danger passed. When the comms cleared, Corrin's face softened, pride in his eyes. He told Myra that she had done what he could not. She had awakened the soul of the fleet again. He said her name will be remembered not as a criminal, but as a guardian of loyalty. Myra bowed, her head, tears running down her cheeks, saying she only did what the ink told her to do. The nebula slowly began to calm, the lightning fading into soft clouds as the fleets floated in silence. Corrin ordered Voss's capture, his soldiers obeying without question. Myra stood quietly watching the stars. She could feel peace for the first time in years, but deep inside she knew the war for truth was never over. It only changed faces. She looked at her glowing tattoo and whispered that as long as it shined, loyalty would never die, and somewhere beyond the stars the Admiral smiled, knowing the fleet had found its heart again. The battle was over, but the sky above Titan Gate still burned with fading trails of fire. The once dark nebula now shimmered with soft blue light. From the awakened fleet, Myra stood on the deck of Serenity, watching hundreds of ships hold their formation in silence. The mark on her arm glowed faintly as if resting after the storm. Orin stood beside her, his uniform torn, his face tired yet calm. They had survived something far greater than war. They had survived the truth. The voice of Admiral Corrin came through the comm steady and clear, saying the Fleet Council had ordered an emergency tribunal to decide the fate of everyone involved in Project Haven. Myra listened quietly, her heart heavy, because she knew what that meant. The truth might be known, but justice was still far away. Orin told her that she would not face it alone, that the entire loyal division now stood behind her, but she smiled faintly, saying loyalty was not a shield, it was a choice, and choices came with a price. When the tribunal began, the entire galaxy watched the broadcast screens across colonies and ships showing the grand hall of the fleet command lined with banners and guards. Myra walked in with her wrists free, yet surrounded by suspicion. Whispers followed her name, called hero by some, traitor by others. She felt the weight of both titles, but kept her head high. Corrin walked beside her, his presence alone silencing the crowd. He had returned from death itself to defend what was right. Commander Voss stood across the room, guarded and pale, his eyes burning with hatred. Though his power was gone, he still had influence. He accused Myra of manipulating the systems of awakening an army that could threaten the peace. He claimed her tattoo was a weapon designed to control the fleet, and that she was never loyal, only ambitious. Corrin rose slowly and said the ink was never a weapon, it was a vow every person who bore it swore to protect life even against command when command lost its way. The tribunal leader, an old admiral named Seren, demanded proof. Corrin nodded toward Myra, and she stepped forward, her voice steady, as she described everything from her arrest to the awakening of the Ghost Fleet. She told them about the message that warned of the attack that almost killed them, and how the ink responded not to commands but to courage. She said that loyalty was never blind, it was a light that guided those who refused to let fear rule their hearts. Voss laughed coldly, saying her word was stories, not evidence. Myra said, then let the ink speak, and before anyone could stop her, she placed a glowing hand on the council table. Her tattoo pulsed once, then projected a stream of blue light across the room, showing Admiral Corrin's old recordings, the true logs of Project Haven. The council watched in silence as images of war refugees and soldiers filled the air. The files showed orders from the High Command demanding destruction of innocent colonies, and showed how Corrin and his division refused those orders, choosing mercy over slaughter. The hall filled with gasps as the truth unfolded. Voss shouted that the files were fake, but Seren ordered them verified. Within moments, the council confirmed their authenticity, and the tide shifted completely. Officers who once whispered against Myra now saluted her. Corrin looked at her, his eyes proud, yet sad, saying the truth was finally seen, but truth had a cost, and the cost was peace shaken across the stars. The people would now question every command, every leader, and he knew that frightened them. As guards moved to arrest Voss, he reached for a hidden weapon, a small blaster. He aimed it toward Myra, shouting that loyalty dies with rebellion. Orin saw it first and moved to block her. The blast hit his shoulder. He fell to the floor. Myra cried out, running to him as Corin's guards overpowered Voss, ending his final act of defiance. Orin smiled weakly, saying she always attracted trouble. She told him not to talk and pressed a hand over his wound. The ink from her tattoo glowed, spreading faintly over his skin, stopping the bleeding. She whispered that loyalty saves even when hate tries to kill. The tribunal ended with Corin reinstated as Fleet Admiral, and Myra cleared of all charges. Her name restored, her title returned. Yet when the council offered her a command, she refused, saying she did not fight to lead. She fought to remind others why leadership mattered. Corin understood and smiled, saying the fleet needed hearts like Hayes, not just rank. She promised to rebuild Project Haven, not as a secret division, but as a promise to all civilians that the fleet would never turn against its own again. Weeks later, the new dawn over Vega Prime was quiet. Ships floated peacefully in orbit, their hulls marked with a small glowing symbol, the same ink that Myra carried, a reminder of what loyalty truly meant. Myra stood on a balcony overlooking the rising sun. Orin stood beside her, his shoulder healed. He teased her, saying she could have been an admiral by now. She laughed softly, saying she would rather be free than powerful. He nodded, saying maybe that was why people followed her without orders. Down below, children painted the blue mark on walls, calling it the Light of Haven. Stories spread of the woman once called a criminal who saved the fleet without firing a single weapon. Corin visited her one last time before returning to command. He said he would carry her story into every world that had forgotten compassion. She thanked him, saying his faith gave her strength. He replied that the ink may fade in light, but loyalty never does, and he saluted her, not as his soldier, but as his equal. As the sun rose higher, Myra closed her eyes, letting the warmth touch her face. She thought of the words that started it all, the Admiral's voice in the dark saying that ink means loyalty, it means courage, it means never turning away from what is right. She looked at her arm and smiled softly, knowing her journey was not over. It had only changed form. She would carry that mark not as a weapon or a wound, but as a living promise that loyalty once awakened could never be silenced again.